Even though the publishing arm of Melbourne House had been sold, Beam continued developing games, growing its staff to 25 people, the largest development team outside of Japan and America at the time. The video game crash of 1983 wasn't felt by Beam, who had initially focused on the home computer market. The sale of Melbourne House to Mastertronic couldn't have come at a better time. The home computer scene was slowing down to make way for exciting new consoles coming out of Japan. Alfred saw this as an opportunity to enter the Japanese market, so he travelled there and bought a Famicom in 1985. Returning to Australia, he hired a university student named Adrian Thulis to reverse engineer the console and create a demo game. He showed it to a Japanese publisher and was told that it was not how things worked in Japan and that Beam was not welcome. Pushing ahead anyway, Alfred bought the American NES on launch and set about reverse engineering that version instead, in hopes of circumventing the 10 NES lockout chip. This chip prevented third parties from releasing their own NES cartridges and was seen as draconian by many budding companies. By 1987, they had successfully bypassed the chip and set about creating a development kit for it. So rather than butt heads with this successful team, Nintendo of America decided they may as well give them a license to produce Nintendo games. This made Beam the second non-Japanese company to develop games on the NES. It was one of the company's defining moments.
We took a gamble and built up technology to develop on the Nintendo system.
They began by porting over a recent Commodore 64 release to test the new hardware, Bad Street Brawler. It was a weird scrolling beat-em-up with dicey music and gameplay. Developer Andrew Davies was only given 2 weeks to turn it into a working title and states the game to be a complete dog. Soon after, the company began developing licensed movie tie-ins for the US market. This is where Acclaim's LJN label comes in. These contracts came in so quickly that staff were generally only given a small amount of time to create working titles for them. The first couple of these was Back to the Future, along with Days of Thunder. All terrible games. Not only did they fail to capture the essence of the movies they were trying to represent, but they were just uninteresting ideas for games in the first place. Beam was still trying to find its feet on home consoles, and the initial struggle was arduous. 1990's The Punisher fared a lot better, combining the license with a unique arcade shooter that pushed the limits of the NES. The same year also saw the release of Aussie games for the Commodore 64, which was a bizarre take on the style of California games. In 1991, Beam developed The Hunt for Red October and Star Wars. This time, both games made efforts to integrate key elements from the movies they were based on. They were in a completely different league to earlier efforts. Star Wars went through a rocky development cycle, being co-developed with Lucasfilm Games. The initial design proved to be too ambitious for the NES to handle. In the end, the game was a hit, taking key scenes from the movie and translating them into a playable Nintendo game. This was possible thanks to 2 programmers that had recently joined Beam, Andrew Carter and Andrew Bailey. They created software tools that changed the face of development on the NES. By this time, Beam was settling into movie tie-ins nicely. They began developing for Nintendo's handheld, the Game Boy. First up was Bill and Ted's excellent Game Boy Adventure, a quirky puzzle platformer based on the popular movie. Next came some licenses, including a port of the Terminator 2 arcade game and NHL Quarterback Club. All were considered to be decent games. However, Australia had its own cultural identity with its own unique sport in Aussie Rules football, which Beam wisely decided to market to. For that, it would need its own local publishing label. In late 1991, the company launched Laser Beam Software, and in another first, became the only Australian company to gain a publishing license from Nintendo. First up were the classic Aussie Rules footy and international cricket for the NES in 1992. Channeling the excitement of the actual sports, they soared to the top of the charts and attracted many Australians to video games.
Out of bounds, on the full.
These fantastic Australian exclusives were developed by Beam's Dream Team. They are considered to be sister titles, sharing many similarities aesthetically. They weren't officially licensed but were very well made and extremely popular. They topped the charts for several years and are remembered fondly by Australian gamers.
I've ordered one of those computerised Aussie Rules games. I've got one where the Swans always win. Next.
92 also saw the release of Nightshade, an ambitious title that combines point-and-click elements with combat in a gritty comic book style setting. Ian Malcolm worked on it with designer Paul Kidd and says he was a great person to work with while referring to him as barking mad. Kidd had a unique vision for the game, but time restraints coupled with the overly ambitious design meant that certain mechanics in the game weren't fleshed out well and it was way too difficult. Its impressive scope was perhaps too much for the NES to handle, but seems to have laid the groundwork for an even more ambitious title to come. Beam were expanding significantly. The culture within the company was changing. They were moving away from the days of the bedroom coder to a more focused company with larger teams of people. Staff doubled during this period of rapid growth. Later that year, Super NES development finally kicked off with Super Smash TV, the hyper-violent twin-stick shooter inspired by the Running Man. It was a fantastic home version of the popular arcade game that managed to enhance the experience rather than detract from it. The next notable release on the SNES was to be Beam Software's magnum opus, their amazing adaptation of tabletop RPG Shadowrun. Its inspiration lay in the popular book Never Deal with a Dragon by Robert N. Charette. In a time when video games were thought to be simple affairs aimed at kids, Beam took a huge risk and crafted a gritty and mature setting for Shadowrun. The narrative opens in Seattle, Washington in the year 2050, where the protagonist Jake Armitage is gunned down in the street. He's then healed by a mysterious woman. Waking up in the morgue and suffering from amnesia, Jake must piece together who wants him dead and why. It is a game full of interesting ideas, utilising an isometric viewpoint and search system similar to point-and-click games of the time. When an NPC is approached, a first-person perspective is displayed, bringing the gritty character to life. It's here that Jake must ask questions and note keywords in order to progress. These moments are punctuated by gun combat that takes place in real time. This game is credited with representing the idea of a Matrix 6 years before the movies of the same name, although it's presented in a very different form. Graham Scott was credited with its creation. Players must use cyberdecks that allow them to hack bank accounts and archives from corporate arcologies. Originally much larger in scope, the team were always under the pump. They begged publisher Data East for a 12 megabit cartridge, but only got 8, so they had to cut and cobble together parts of the game. Surprisingly, this only enhanced the atmosphere of the chaotic city. Unfortunately, the game sold poorly in the US thanks to Data East fumbling the marketing campaign and releasing the game in limited numbers. It was one of the most obtuse and difficult games of its time. The player has to piece everything together little by little, with no hand-holding and enormous odds stacked against them. Its story and atmosphere stand at the peak of Beam's many triumphs. Their most ambitious game ever. In 1994, Super International Cricket followed and is my favourite cricket game of all time. It came bundled with the SNES and featured a hilarious marketing campaign that saw ads like these featured in the Aussie NMS magazine. It was so well received that Aussie dads everywhere bought their kids a Super NES just so they could secretly play it. Super International Cricket was not exclusive to Australia and was published by Nintendo overseas. It fixes many issues the original game had and is a much smoother experience. Just like its precursor, it didn't carry official team or player licensing, but the game was so fun it didn't really matter. Around this time, Beam created a Game Boy engine starring Tom and Jerry that eventually became Baby T-Rex. Later on, it was used again as the engine for Agrosaur, a game based on a popular morning cartoon show at the time. Later in the year, they expanded on Baby T-Rex with the Super NES release Radical Rex.
He's my real cool Radical Rex. Radical Rex!
It's a decent platformer with nice graphics and plenty of weird gimmicks like skateboarding. I guess this was also their attempt at a mascot character, and unfortunately, it didn't sell well and to this day remains virtually unknown. With the advent of Windows 95 and the rise of the internet, Beam began focusing on PlayStation, Saturn and PC development. They produced The Dame Was Loaded, a point-and-click adventure using FMV in the style of Myst. It featured live-action scenes developed by Vixen Films. At the time, it was the largest multimedia project in Australia. 1996 saw the release of Cricket 96 for MS-DOS. This was the year that Beam became the first publicly listed video game company on the Australian Stock Exchange, greatly increasing their recognition here in Australia. They teamed up with Microsoft on one of its earliest forays as a games publisher, developing NBA Full Court Press. They ported the 3DO's excellent mascot platformer Gex to Sony and Sega's machines. By this time, 3D gaming was on the horizon. Sony and Nintendo were making inroads with titles like Wipeout and Mario 64, so Beam Software had to follow suit. By 1997, they had developed Cricket 97, the first 3D cricket game with commentary from the famous Richie Benaud.
Ideal for hanging in the den, the boardroom, or even the bedroom, if it comes to that.
Soon after, they discovered that Virgin had let the name of Melbourne House lapse, and Beam decided it was time to take it back. Throughout this golden era of Australian game development, Beam were credited with 28 NES games, 8 Mega Drive titles, 14 on Super NES, 25 on Game Boy, and several for Sony, Sega and Windows. They were, quite simply, prolific. Even so, with the jump to 3D, the world was changing dramatically, and Beam was struggling to keep up. A classic pioneer waning in the eye of a burgeoning industry. They realised AAA gaming was on the rise and that a few major publishers were going to be dominating the market. What would be their contribution to this new market, and how does this story end? Tune in next time to find out. Thanks for watching.